Welcome to today's webinar, Farm Energy Management. We're going to be talking about the impact of energy on farm electricity costs. We have two presenters today, myself, John Hay from University of Nebraska Extension, and Eric Romick from The Ohio State University Extension. And we're both energy educators in our respective states, and we're interested in talking with farmers about reducing the cost of that they pay for electricity. We're going to talk about, this is a 3-webinar series, and today we're going to talk about the energy charges or the charges related to cost per kilowatt hour. There's other energy charges that are on an electric bill, such as demand and power factor charges, and we're going to talk about those in future web seminars. Really, we're interested in this because it's a high cost, and really also farmers are interested in this. In a survey done by Ohio State, shows that 72% are very concerned about electricity prices, 75% want to learn more to minimize those costs, and 57% of those farmers are on rates that have demand charges. And so those demand charges are a really important piece of this web seminar series, but we need to get started by talking about energy costs and the cost per kilowatt hour so that we can kind of build up to understanding more about those demand charges. What are the rules of the game? In this case, the rules are going to be the rate structure, how an operation is charged for electricity, the farm operation details themselves, how that farm uses electricity, and then finally the management practices to try to reduce those costs. So in this case, what are you charged for? Is it energy? Is it demand? Is it just a base fee for hooking up? How is that measured? When is it measured and calculated? And then finally, what are those costs? The operation details are, when do you use energy? Is it all year? Is it just part of the year? How much do you use? What actually uses it? What is the equipment inventory? And then those non-essential and non-essential operations, are there operations that we can either move or turn off? And then finally, the management practices of efficiency, power quality, load shifting, peak shaving, and on-site management, or on-site generation like solar, which we're not going to get into in great detail, but we could talk about in other web seminars. So this is just a picture of some of the loads that might be on an operation, and you can see in this image there's lots of big electric motors, as well as lighting and ventilation. And these are just a small list of some of the various loads that there could be: grain bins and fans and pumps and things like that. And so it's going to be a matter of understanding all of these loads, and maybe even making a list of all of them on a farm is one way we recommend to begin trying to understand how to make some savings. Farm income is up. That's good, but also farm expenses are up. And 2022 is going to be a real interesting year with respect to farm expenses because of inflation and other things, that those expenses have gone up quite a bit. And so it's, good operators, try to market their products to make as much money as possible, but also try to minimize those expenses to try to maximize that net income. We're just going to touch just a little bit on the electric marketplace as an overarching concept so we can kind of get deeper in. Electricity, you're buying it from a utility, but your utility is many times a member of a regional organization that cooperates all together. And that's important because sometimes you'll see on your bill charges that relate to these organizations. And so in this case, in Nebraska, it's the Southwest Power Pool. In Ohio, it's the PJM Interconnect. These are both regional transmission organizations, while you also have organizations that are similar called independent service operators, ISOs. And so there's all this cooperation going on. This cooperation is for some pretty important purposes. One of those is reliable supplies of electricity, as well as adequate transmission infrastructure and competitive prices. So these regional organizations are suggesting, or we're hoping that they the cooperation across a region will increase our reliability and lower the overall prices. And so that's kind of some regional things, but more locally, it depends on what state you're in, how some of these things kind of come about and how these rates are built. An example of that is this idea of regulation versus deregulation. Ohio, Michigan, Illinois have deregulated electricity marketplaces. Nebraska has a regulated electricity marketplace. And then there's also regulation, deregulation in natural gas. And so this also has some mix of that, as you can see across the north central region of the United States. An example of a regulated marketplace, actually to a high extent, is Nebraska. Nebraska not only is regulated from an electricity marketplace, but also has a statute that says all of our utilities must be public utilities. So we have a mix of public utilities, public power districts, and co-ops, and then finally municipal systems, but all of which are publicly owned. And so an example of a regulated marketplace might be, let's just put a dot on a map in Nebraska, that all of your electricity is purchased through that utility based on where you are. That includes all components of that electricity. You can't look across a border of the utility and say, well, that other utility has a better rate schedule. They charge a different rate for electricity. I'd like to have their rate schedule. You can't do it. You are very much regulated within that. And because of that company is a nonprofit, the hope is that they're giving you the best possible deal that they can. But I will tell you, there's a lot of variability about how those rates are structured and how they're built and how they're charged for electricity. So a lot of variability. That's true everywhere in regulated and deregulated marketplaces, but in regulated, you're very much dictated that you must buy all component parts of electricity from one single utility. That's very common in a regulated marketplace. Eric, tell us a little bit about a deregulated marketplace.
Sure, John. So, as you're mentioning, Ohio is very different from Nebraska. So, in the late 90s, Ohio transitioned from a regulated market to a deregulated market. So what that means is essentially you have the ability to make some additional choices. And so the map on the left is showing all of the investor-owned utilities or electric distribution companies in Ohio, and which there's 4, and then 25 of our rural electric cooperatives. In addition, on the right, you can see that lists the 84 Ohio municipal electric providers in the state. And so, when you think about it, like these are the companies that own the infrastructure, the distribution infrastructure that's bringing that product to your home or business or farm. With that said, you have the ability to purchase your generation from whoever you want in Ohio. And so you can see the image there in the center of the screen that says apples to apples. That is on Ohio's Public Utilities Commission website, where you can go and you can compare different electric rate offers, or also actually, on a side note, natural gas, it applies as well. But from an electric standpoint, you can go ahead and shop your generation to purchase it from whoever you want. And you would still have that same delivery provider that owns the infrastructure delivering that generation to your home or business. But it gives you the freedom to shop different types of rate structures. So you can look at it and see what are the terms. You could look at a variable rate. You can look at a fixed rate for 12 months, 24, 36 months, and so forth. There's also the ability to filter based on the renewable portfolio of those individual generators. So, but yes, in Ohio, we do have a deregulated market that gives you a little more freedom to choose who you buy generation from.
All right, thank you. So as we move into that electric bill, this will become a little clearer. Every electric bill is going to have some overarching component parts. And really all of these are going to be included in every bill, but they're not always included in every rate structure, right? So that's a weird way to say it, but there's almost always going to be a charge customer fixed charge. You can imagine if you hooked up to the electric grid on a home or farm and never used any electricity, you're still being charged for being connected. And that's this customer fixed charge. There's an energy charge, which is the charges that are charged per kilowatt hour. So as you use more electricity, your energy charges go up. A demand charge is based on some peak amount of electricity you use. And so if you use a lot all at one time, that demand charge is going to go up. Transmission and distribution charges are charges that are trying to recoup the costs in order to maintain the distribution and transmission infrastructure. And a lot of times we see these charged sometimes as demand, sometimes as energy, and sometimes they're kind of just mixed in or put in under energy or demand charges and not specifically spelled out. So they definitely are in a bill, but they're not always clearly spelled out. And finally, cost recovery charges and other charges like taxes and fees are going to be in. And again, sometimes they're charged by energy or demand rates. And again, additional charges like taxes and fees and things like that you're going to see. So another way to look at it is that customer charge is for overhead and infrastructure, paying for the people that are running the utility, maybe paying for a little bit of the infrastructure. The generation is going to go to pay for the energy itself. Sometimes they add a little bit of cost in there for the infrastructure of the distribution and transmission, but the energy itself you can think of as I'm paying. That's the actual kilowatt hours, and then the transmission and distribution are there to pay for the infrastructure. And so you can kind of realize that, all of these can be tied into that electric bill somewhere because they need to be paid for, but how those are organized is going to be quite variable. And I just have some examples. Here's an example of a fairly detailed electric bill where the total price is $1,949. And I know that most of you farmers are going to say, well, I get my electric bill and I pay it. And they don't spend a lot of time. And that's because it's frustrating or difficult to spend a lot of time with. We're arguing that it would be important to begin to do so. So the idea here is that if you're paying $1,949 a month for this electric bill and you use 12,000 kilowatt hours during that month, we could simply assume that we're paying 15.7 cents per kilowatt hour. Well, the trouble is that's not quite right. It doesn't equate to that. So if you were to save a kilowatt hour, maybe buy an energy efficient machine or something like that, you're not saving 15 cents a kilowatt hour. And that's because of these other of the way it's actually charged. This middle cost recovery section has the customer charge of $22. It also has some other riders that are charged either per kilowatt hour or per kW. They add up to $155, which is not a major part, the largest part of that bill. Energy is a big part of that bill at $668. But when we start to think, if we're paying $668 for our energy or our generation, that's actually 6.3 cents. So when we're saving that kilowatt hour, we're actually saving only 6 cents, not 15.7. So where's the rest of that come from? It comes from demand, which is that peak of 89 kW that I set during that billing period. This bill charges $1,126 for that demand. We're going to go into demand in more detail in the other web seminar, so you can go and link to that and see it. But in this case, 58% of the costs are in demand, and only 34% of the cost is in generation. This isn't to say that saving energy is not good. It just may not reduce your bill as much as you expect, because it only saves 6.3 cents to save energy. Saving demand can save quite a bit more. A couple other electric bills just for fun that I want to throw out. A residential and a grain bin one. This residential one, I've taken out all the identifying properties in it, but I did not really take out any numbers. This is all that was given. All that was given was that this home used 402 kilowatt hours that month, and the cost $61.73. Well, we have no idea what's the customer charge, how much for energy, if there was a demand charge, and how transmission distribution were built into that. We just have no idea. So the reality is, what I'm trying to say is that your electric bill is not a good place to go for detailed information. You need to go to the rate schedule. And if you can't get that on your company's website, you need to go call them up and ask them for it. They will give you a more spelled out version of that rate schedule. This farm grain bin did separate out, it combined generation and transmission, and then separated out distribution. So we have a little bit of separation here, but we really don't know if we're charged for energy, for demand, what's the customer charge. We don't have any of that detail, and it would be nice to have that detail to understand how to save on this electricity. The idea here is that things are changing, and really what's changing is not so much the electric grid itself, it's the meter that's changing. And so there's new meters that are kind of advanced computer meters going in. Sometimes they're called AMI meters, advanced meter infrastructure, and that meter can not only record the amount of electricity used, but it can record the time of day it was used, the peak it was used during a billing period. It can record the load's impact on power quality. So in this case, power factor that we're going to talk about in another webinar. And it can even measure in 2 directions if need be, in the case that there is solar or other renewables connected behind the meter. So this meter can do a lot of things. Because of that, now we can actually make rate schedules more complex and pass charges to customers more accurately than before. And we are seeing utilities do that. Energy is, and as a definition, energy is the ability to do work. We can also think about it as kind of the total. How much total was used at the end of a time period. Power is that instantaneous use, how much is used instantaneously. We're talking about energy today. The next webinar on demand is going to talk about power. So in the case I have a time period, let's call this a day worth of energy use, we can see that the peak moment was pretty high, but in the case of energy, we're interested in the total amount under the curve. So power times a unit time is equal to energy. So in this case, kW or kilowatts is our power, the hours is the time element, and we get kilowatt hours, which is what we're charged for. One trap that we all fall into is taking some average prices across an entire area and saying, well, look, Nebraska's electricity is 8.97 cents per kilowatt hour on average, and in Ohio it's 9.44. Well, that's true, except for any individual rate schedule is going to be quite a bit different. And this is some average across all sectors. Different sectors are going to be different, residential versus commercial versus industrial. So there's all these different complexities to that. And so although the average gives us some sense of the price of electricity, there are rates in Nebraska that are over 20 cents. There are rates in Ohio that are that have times that are under 4 or 5 cents. And so there's a lot of variability out there, and you need to understand the rate schedule. Here's an example of that, where here's 2 rate schedules that exist in Nebraska. These actually happen to be residential rate schedules, but they tell us a story. This is every month on the X or the Y-axis, and then the time of day on the X-axis, and so you can look at every month of the year and say that in the summer on this rate schedule on the left, basically 8 to 10 cents is the cost of electricity, depending on how much you use in the month. In the wintertime, it's all 6.7 cents. Pretty simple. We know the price of electricity at essentially any day of the year and time of day. On the right, they are splitting the price out based on the time of day, and the highest is 20 cents, the lowest is 4.7. So to say that I'm going to save a kilowatt hour of electricity depends on what time of day did I save that kilowatt hour electricity. And so that is an important distinction with respect to rate schedules, is that how or when is that electricity, what price. And so looking at that rate schedule can teach you a lot of things about when you should try to save your electricity. I'm going to turn it over to Eric to talk about commercial electric bills and give us some examples.
So yeah, as John mentioned, we're going to kind of walk through a breakdown of a couple, I guess, of a sample commercial electric bill, and then take a look at, as we were describing earlier, the farm energy management equation. Kind of, we'll look at both sides of that equation, understanding, excuse me, understanding your electric bill, and then also looking at how that applies to a farm where we've collected some research data on, and hopefully it'll help you maybe visualize how things are operating on your farm as it relates to how your bill's structured. So before we jump into it, I did want to real quickly just kind of plug this website that is available through the U.S. Department of Energy's National Lab. It's the OpenEI database, and I think it's a really good starting point for someone that's interested in trying to kind of, at a high level, wrap your head around how you're charged for electricity. It does a good job of summarizing energy charges versus demand charges, if there's any types of seasonal time of use or tiered usage time of use. It does a really good job to start summarizing that, breaking it down for you. I will note that sometimes these rates tend to lag a little bit based on updates from the utilities. So I'd certainly encourage you to start here, but then ultimately reach out to your utility provider to get the details of your rate tariff. So this here's a snapshot from a bill here in Ohio with one of the farms that we've been working with on some research data, and it, I think, helps summarize how complex these can be. I mean, John shared an example earlier of a bill that was, quite the opposite of this. It had very little detail. Here, there's so much information, you don't know where to start to dissect what you're being charged for and how they're calculating that. And so we're going to do just that. We're going to walk through this bill and try and understand how did they get to this total balance of $1,967. Now, at a high level, if you kind of do the breakdown of this, essentially 20% of this bill is based on energy charges, and that's really what we're focusing on today. We've kind of structured this webinar series so that we'll walk through this same bill, and we'll touch on it each week and look at energy charges. Next week, we'll come back and give it a look at how the demand charges in this bill are impacted. But today, kind of when we think about that bill, we're going to focus on 20% of that total $1,967 related to the energy charges. John did a really good job of kind of setting the stage to help us distinguish in our mind the difference between kilowatt hours and kW. So there's a lot of times kind of this mix up between energy and demand. And when we think about energy charges, which we're talking about today, illustrated here with the shaded area graph, we're think about volumetric charges, right? So everything it's inside this shaded area is what we're paying for. So when we look at the different items in this bill, the first one that we come across is a energy charge, is the retail stability rider. And I want you to kind of take a note. This is intentional that we have this page 208 at the bottom here. And the reason for that is I want to make sure that we highlight it's not always easy to get this information. It's not as simple as getting your bill and maybe reading the front or back of your bill to figure out where these charges are coming from. Many times to get into the final details of this, you need to pull your rate sheet from that utility, which in some cases may be available online, but in many cases you may have to request that from the utility provider as well. But in this example, we were on page 208 to try and track down and see how are we charged for this retail stability rider. And you can see here there's different rate schedules that apply, and they have different rates based on that. This is a general service secondary or GS2 rate. And you can see we're charged 5.25 cents per kilowatt hour for the first 833,000 kilowatt hours, which obviously we didn't use more than that in this instance. And so you can see if we do the math there, that's where our 4176 is coming from. And once again, just as a reminder, this is an energy-based fee. So it's based on the total number of kilowatt hours over that billing period. So moving down this list, and you'll notice that we skipped the deferred asset rider, so they don't necessarily go in order. And again, you have to really dive into the rate sheet to see, is this charge, as you can see up here, is this charge based on kilowatt hours, or in some cases it may just say KW, which in that case would be a demand-based fee. So our next energy-based fee was the phase-in recovery rider in this example. And as you can see on page 204 of our rate sheet, we could kind of dive in to see where our voltage delivery was from and what category we fell into. We were charged 0.555 cents per kilowatt hour. So if we back it out and do the math times our 5,760 kilowatt hours that we had in that billing period, our charge was $31.97. So you can see we kind of matched up with our phase-in recovery rider. Again, energy-based fee. Moving along, the power purchase agreement rider. We dive into this one and see that it is based on 0.06003 cents per kilowatt hour. And again, you really have to pay attention to your decimal places and you know, whether it's dollars per kilowatt hour, cents per kilowatt hour, and pay attention to how you're moving that decimal place. But if we do the math here times our 5,670 kilowatt hours, you see we were at $3.45. So you notice that there's a little bit of difference between, you know, the 290 and the 345. And sometimes I think what we run into here is very simply a rounding error. Again, that can sometimes be related to, you know, maybe the kilowatt hours that we have here. I have 5,760. I didn't carry out anything past that decimal point, whereas, you know, maybe I rounded up and they didn't. So sometimes I think there's rounding errors that might make up for some of this slight differences that we'll see. Finally, the generation charge, and this is the one that I think most of us think about when we say, you know, how much do you pay for electricity? A lot of times we'll simply take the total and divide it by the total kilowatt hours used. So we might say, well, $1,967 divided by our 5760, that was our total usage. Say, oh, well, that's what we pay per kilowatt hour. But that's, as you can see, a little bit misleading here. And so if we really dive into it and break down what we're charged for the generation component of our bill, on this rate schedule, they're charged 5.323 cents per kilowatt hour. And so as we work that math out, $306.60 is allocated towards the actual generation charges. So when we think about the energy charges, you know, this portion of it is what we're actually paying for the generation is 5.323 cents. But as we just looked at, there was a total of 4 of these items here that were based on kilowatt hour fees. And so it's really important to see, yeah, we pay 5.323 cents per kilowatt hour for generation, but there's additional fees that are based on energy consumption that would need to be lumped into that. So that's kind of a good transition point where we can think about moving into looking at how this impacts our farm, right? So to do that, I want to look at some data from a few of our research sites, and just a real quick overview. Here at Ohio, we have a number of sites that we've partnered with. Some of them are OSU, OERDC research sites. Others are private farms that we've partnered with to conduct some research. And so you can see we have 4 dairy sites, kind of in the northeast or north central part of the state. 3 swine sites, and then 2 grain sites as well, where we're collecting some data with some advanced energy meters to help us better understand what's happening on those on these farms. And so to give you kind of a sense of what that equipment might look like, this is a picture of one of our hog farms where we've installed some meters that on this specific meter, it allows us to monitor up to 24 single phase circuits where essentially we can get an energy profile for all the critical motor loads or operations on that farm. And we have that set to collect data points every 5 minutes. So we're collecting energy data, peak demand data, power factor data, harmonics over that 5 minute interval. And we've been working on many of these sites going back to 2018. So we have some pretty good historical data on these sites now as well. So earlier we were talking about the rules of the game, and I think we just really kind of wrapped up with our earlier discussion that first part of the equation, which was, really understanding your rate structure. And so now we're going to look at the second part of the equation, which is understanding the details of your farm operation. And when we think about that, we really want to recognize seasonal and daily use patterns of the farm, energy trends, peak demand trends. And we recognize that not everybody's going to have the ability to have this detailed level of data. But one of the things that I hope the data we're going to share will help you do is maybe visualize how your farm operates. And I think one of the things that's helpful is just think about the trends, right? So what time of year does certain equipment run? Is there seasonal equipment that runs only in the summer or only in the winter? Where are our largest motors? So think about, take an inventory of the motors on your farm. How big are they? Where are the biggest ones? When do they run? How long do they run? Do they have to run at that specific time? So kind of thinking about what operations may be essential or non-essential. Not to say that a non-essential load doesn't need to take place, but maybe it would be an opportunity to run that load at a different time of day or a different time of year. So the first set of data we're going to look at is from our dairy farm. And I want to start out by looking at this information from an annual perspective. And so you'll see that this is the total energy use on that dairy farm. It's itemized by color. So you can see here that we have vacuum pump motor operations, feed and well. And so you'll start to notice that some of this stuff we've kind of aggregated for simplicity purposes, so we can make sense of the data and visually in this chart. But the feed and well pump are on the same circuit that we have monitored there. We combined our vacuum pump operations and the milk cooling and the stir fans as well, so that we can kind of look at it from a ventilation standpoint versus manure pump, milk cooling. And you'll notice, obviously, that there's a significant spike seasonally that occurs, right around that May-June timeframe, which we would expect. And obviously, as this is color-coded, we can see that spike in usage is, for the most part, due to ventilation demands that pick up. So one of the things that we want to do is kind of start high, and we're going to zoom into from this annual perspective to look at the peak week or the peak time that this farm was setting a demand. And so in this instance, it was July 14th when the farm set its highest demand. And remember earlier when John was talking about the variable energy charges, we need to think about that in terms of when this farm is using and consuming energy for different operations. And so I kind of put this window out here to kind of help visualize the daytime hours, right? But if we and not that this rate, this daily and seasonal time of use rate is going to apply for every farm, or it actually doesn't. It's not the rate that's used on this specific farm, but I think for educational purposes, it helps us visualize what the impact of a time of use rate could be on a dairy operation. And so while we think about what's happening here, you can see there the manure pump or the lagoon pump is running here in this day, which really contributed to this overall demand spike. And so what would the potential be to run that manure pump at a different time, right? So there's no reason that we couldn't shift that load to run it, you know, in the early morning hours when we could potentially have a lower rate. So you can see here that this time of use rate, as you move earlier. So if we look at 12 a.m. to 6 a.m., you know, depending on the month of year, you're going to be 4.7 to 5 cents per kilowatt hour. So much cheaper than what you would be if you're running in the middle of the day at this 8.7 cents. So the other way that we could look at that is, you know, even if we are not able to move it to a time of day when there's a lower rate, is to think about, boy, how do we avoid the, you know, if you were to have a time of use rate that would have something so high as 20 cents per kilowatt hour in the middle of the afternoon, you know, during those summer months when it's really hot and there's a lot of air conditioning loads running. What do we have to do to avoid that, right? So just the fact that we're running this, you know, from 6:15 to say 9 o'clock is really good to just make sure that maybe we miss that window from 3 o'clock to 9 o'clock. And so, you know, the point is, and I think, I hope that this slide helps to visualize both sides of that equation, right? Both understanding your rate structure. So you have to do the homework and dig into the details to understand how your rates are applied. If you have a variable rate structure, is it seasonal? Is it daily? Is it both? And then look at your operations to see how that might be impacted. And again, there's certain functions that you may not be able to change, right? So you can see with our vacuum pump motors, it's you kind of see the cycles here. So looks like there's probably a 3 o'clock milking that starts with this blue here, and you can see that they wrap up, and then there's a spike where they're probably flushing out the lines. And it looks like, again, we're probably around noon, having our second milking cycle. Wraps up, a little bit of spike where they're flushing the lines, and then an evening cycle that probably starts around 7 o'clock. And so, you know, we can learn a lot from diving into that data and kind of looking at when the farm's running. Obviously, these are essential operations that we can't change, but it's still helpful to see how the different loads are interacting with one another from that timing sequence. So I want to transition and share a little bit of data from a swine farm. And so this is a 2,400 head finishing barn that we've collected some data on. And so right off the bat, you'll notice that it's kind of difficult to see. And I just wanted to point out that the reason for that is I've kind of purposely scaled this at the same scale that we were looking at from our dairy farm. And the point is to just maybe highlight that, you know, this farm doesn't use nearly as much energy as what the dairy site was. We're going to go ahead and adjust that scale so that we can see this annual data a little bit more clearly and start to make some sense of what's happening. So once again, we're looking at a energy usage from this swine farm over the calendar year. And so we're collecting, again, our energy meters are collecting data every 5 minutes, and they actually lump them into what's referred to as a 15-minute interval energy usage. And so they look at the watt hours or kilowatt hours per 15-minute interval. And then we can kind of add those up over the course of the billing cycle or the month or the year, however we wanted to look at that. Again, we have this color coded by operation, and you can see that we have, again, a lot of ventilation loads as we would expect on this site. And so the yellow color here is representing our pit fans. The red is representing our tunnel fans, and then of course feed augers and heaters as well. You can see the heaters kind of kick on and off a little bit in the shoulder months. The other thing that we need to think about when we're thinking about an operation like this is also there's going to be certain times where, you know, the animals are at different weights, and so, you know, as you cycle and load out a load and bring new hogs in, then you're going to have different ventilation needs based on the size and weight of those animals, and the number as well as you have your load out schedules. So you need to think about how the barn's operating, you know, from an operational standpoint as well, that could impact some of those energy loads. So like we did with the dairy, we wanted to kind of zoom in on that July 14th day, which is when we set our largest peak. And, you know, there's really not as much going on as you can see with this site. We'll put the time frame to kind of highlight the daytime hours here. There's not as much going on as what we saw with the dairy farm. And again, our ventilations, you can see this time of year, I'd say that the ventilation fans 4 and 5 were off during the evening hours, and it looks like around 7:30, when the sun starts to come up, starts to warm up, that 4th and 5th ventilation stage from the tunnel kicked on. And at this point, we have our pit fans running pretty much full speed. Here we would have our 36-inch, and then our first two 54-inch tunnels were running through the night. And then 54-inch number 4 and 5 kicked on, and then they just ran all day long. And so not as much here, because once again, ventilation loads are essential loads. We really can't do a lot when they're running at this full capacity anyhow, to save energy consumption. Now, we could look at, you know, as we think of this from an annual perspective, if we back up one slide, you know, we could look at what's the potential for some energy conservation using some high efficiency fans that may help during the shoulder months of the season to minimize that overall load. But overall, not a lot that we can do here. Still important to think about it and kind of work through the process of understanding your variable time of use rates and how that farm might work. One thing you can see that I'll kind of point out here as we look at our feed augers is, you know, most of the time those feed auger loads are staggered. But you can see that here, this in this instance, we did have a couple of times where the feed auger motors were coming on or cycling on at the same time. So there's a little bit heavier use as illustrated in gray. So I want to wrap up with one of our example from one of our grain storage facilities. Again, as we think about energy usage and grain storage, it's very seasonal. So that's the one takeaway that we would have from this load profile. You can see that we really don't use a whole lot of energy throughout the course of the year. However, when we get to the harvest season, as you'd expect, the dryers start running, and we use a significant amount of energy, you know, in the October, November, December timeframe. When we think about time of use as it relates to grain storage facilities, this type of a time of use that we've been referencing throughout the presentations, not very likely to be on this type of a meter. But a lot of times, I guess the reason for putting this in here is a lot of times we will see a specific rate structure for grain dryer facilities or grain storage facilities that have you know, seasonal use worked into it. So it's important again to understand that seasonal aspect. As we wrap up and start to transition into some questions and answers, you know, we're interested in hearing you know, what type of energy efficiency or energy conservation practices you've used in your farm. But before we jump into that conversation, just kind of a reminder that, again, we were focused on one aspect of this bill today, which is energy. I think that it's very important to do this high-level breakdown of your bill to see Is it energy or demand that's making up the largest component of your bill? Because in this example, obviously demand makes up a larger component of this farm's bill than energy. And as a teaser for webinar number 2 next week, we're really going to dive into the demand charges and what is it in a 15-minute window that's causing 79% of this bill. But for today, we were focusing on energy. The thing to remember is this could be reversed. You could have you could have a bill that does not have high demand charges, and a big component of that bill is going to be focused on energy. And so in that instance, energy efficiency practices could have much more higher returns than, say, some type of load shifting that could have a greater return for demand. So it's really important to take the first step of that equation, as we've talked about, understand your rate structure, and then start to look at that farm and see, how does this farm operate, and how does it interact with the way that we're calculated, so that we can implement the best farm management practices for our farm. So at this time, I'd like to pass it back to John, and we can take some Q&A and start to work through the wrap up.
Well, thank you for joining us today. We appreciate it. We have our contact information on the screens here if you'd like to contact and discuss these topics in more detail. And we'll move over to questions, but we're going to stop the recording and have a wonderful day.
Thanks, John. Thanks, guys.